because you'd basically be saying communism, which originated from a Jew and was put in place by the Bolsheviks, who were disproportionately Jewish,
That's
then took
incorrect.
over the. Oh, it is. This will be good. All right, I'll give you 15 seconds to explain to me how the Bolsheviks were not disproportionately Jewish, and then I'm probably going to remove you from speaker.
You
You're so
can, but
generous, Ian. You really
you
are.
have what, eight main figureheads and two of them were Jewish? Why is that disproportionate?
So that's false. It wasn't eight main
Why is it? Go
figureheads.
ahead. Who are
Well,
they?
first of all, you
Who?
had
And
three
not
main
only that,
authors.
are you also gonna
Well, are you
mention? Are you gonna
gonna?
mention the Jewish ones that were also
Are
executed
you?
after the communists came to
Are
power?
you sure? Sure. Yeah. Well, let's go one step at a time. So, who drafted the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital? Well, I mean, you had Moses Mordecai Levy, changed his
Are
name
you
to Karl
talking about the
Marx.
Marxists?
Descendant. If you don't, Marxist, the Jews basically, the Jews that drafted the Communist Manifesto, and he's
So
also
you're
financed by
using Marx
Rothschild.
as one
If you don't
Jew.
mind, if you, they're the same thing. Judaism is communist. So let's. Well, you know what? Why don't we hear what some Jews, how Jews
So
describe
wait, so you're
communism?
saying also
Jews
because
admits.
Jesus was Jewish?
Can you be quiet, please? So the communist soul is the soul of Judaism. Hence, it follows that just as the Russian Revolution, the triumph of communism was the triumph of Judaism. This was Rabbi Harry Watton. It was cited in Jews and Humanity, page 143 to 144. The Jewish elements provide the driving forces for communism. This is Dr. Oscar Levy and George Pitt Rivers, The World Significance of the Russian Revolution, Oxford, 1920. Some may call it communism, but I call it what it is, Judaism. This is Rabbi Stephen S. Weiss in the American Bulletin on March 15, 1935. It was Vladimir Putin himself who said that about 85% of the Soviet regime was made up of Jews. So, Moses Mordecai Levy plus Frederick Engels and Moses Hess, they're all Jews. They all contributed towards the authorship of the Communist Manifesto and later Das Kapital, which created the blueprint essentially for communism to take place. Communism was funded by Jews, multiple Jews, including Max Warburg and Jacob Schiff, and also Armand Hammer.
What was the
There's
percentage?
three
Truth.
Jews that
Truth.
financed.
Sorry, I
I
got I
just
got side.
gave you
No,
I
I got
gave you
sidetracked
percentage,
for
and now
giving
you're
too much.
asking. I don't know why you keep interrupting me. I know it inside and out. I know who all the figureheads were, both the secret police, the Cheka, the NKVD, and later the KGB. And I can go further than that. I can go into details, and I'll also mention those Jews who were later killed, not because they were Jewish and because they caused the mass murders of, by that point, over 30 million Russians, but no, they were killed because they posed as double agents. Stalin himself was a Jew. It was Lev Bronstein, you call him Leon Trotsky, who created the army for the USSR, the Red Army, essentially, that did the invasion of Russia when it was at its weakest point during World War One. And there were two invasions. There was one in February, and then there was the October invasion. And even during that interim government, you had Kamensky. He himself was a Jew as well. And then it was essentially taken over by both Lenin, Trotsky briefly, and then of course it was Stalin who took over from around 1923 all the way up to about 1953. He ruled for almost 30 years. He himself was a Jew, of course. In addition to that, you had the likes of Yagoda, Yeshov, Beria, Kaganovich. I can go on. These are just a list of Jews that oversaw the gulags, essentially, where millions of Russians were essentially put to the death. And of course, you had the Holodomor, which took place in 1932 to 33, where about 10 million Russians were starved to death. Holodomor just means death by starvation, by the way. It's not meant to be a big word. That's just a correct characterization of what actually took place through the process of what the Jews called collectivization. They stole the wheats, the oats, the rye, the barley, all the major components of nutrition that the Russians relied on for their food, and they starved them to death. They gave them nothing to eat. They died. 10 million plus died in the regions of Kazakhstan and the regions of Belarus, better known as Belarus now, and of course within Russia proper itself. I mean, this is even disputed. Both the Duma have acknowledged this, including to the Ukrainian parliament as well, have acknowledged that they don't necessarily agree on the numbers. One says 7 million, another says 8 million. Some estimates are as high as 10 million, and they're still digging up burials of Russians that were killed by starvation, also from the gulags that were imposed by them by the Soviet Jewish overlords once they took over Russia and turned it into a communist state. Communism essentially is just a manifestation of Judaism. It's two sides of the same coin between communism and Zionism, which represents Judaism. They're both manifestations of what Judaism is all about, which is to create a slave state out of the Gentiles, whether in Palestine through Zionism or whether in Russia and also the other communist states, because Russia, the USSR, is also an expansionist state. It had 15 satellites in total. They also pushed this ideology and spread it by force, because communism does entail a violent overthrow of the establishment and to then give control to the so-called proletariats, Though you know what's interesting, Ian, is none of the authors, none of the perpetrators of communists were actually proletariats themselves. They were all outsiders looking in. Most of them came from very wealthy families, like Lev Bronstein himself, and they were funded by what would be the equivalent of billionaires, trillionaires today through the Federal Reserve. It was funded by a lot of rich people, rich Jews in charge, who wanted to essentially take over Russia, to steal its gold, install a Rothschild bank, and then impose debt slavery on the entire society. Because Russia actually had one of the most sophisticated and advanced labor systems known to the world at that time. And this isn't me talking, by the way. This is President William Howard Taft of America, who went to Russia himself before World War I and attested to this himself. And he was blown away by how incredible Russia's labor system and practices were, because he wanted to replicate that model in America as well. I think Murphy's trying to get up. So much of the world admired how Russia was running this operation, except for the Jews there. They were carrying out consistent terrorist operations, thousands of them towards the end, by the way, before World War I, before they were able to successfully, this time, overthrow Tsar Nicholas II Romanov and his entire family. They killed his wife, all five of his kids, through ritualistic Jewish fashion, as well as the Jews like to do, and they even killed his dogs. This was by 1918. And let's not forget that during this time, 4 empires were overthrown by design within 20 years of the Communist Manifesto, which came out in 1897, and of course the Jewish Bund League, which was also established in 1897, such that within 20 years there were the invasions of, both within Russia, Prussia, the Ottoman Empire, and of course you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all of which were decimated by Jewish nefarious powers that were in place in each country. So when you say 2 out of the 8 figureheads, it's completely misleading. I mean, there were 3 financiers and 3 authors of just communism alone, in addition to all the leadership. And I can go through names such as Naftali Frankel as well, who's the head administrator of the Gulag, who administered the penal code / nutritional scale, such that the least productive slave, essentially, that was building the canal would miss a meal, essentially. They would steal a meal from him. And the most productive would get an extra meal, and this led to the starvation as well, as there were 70 famines imposed by the Jews between 1917 and 1991 within USSR Russia, and that's how they were able to mainly kill off, about 100 million Russians, both through death by starvation, of course, through spread of disease. They tortured them to death, and of course, sometimes they just spent the money on a bullet and shot them in the head as well. The Jews mixed it up in terms of how they wanted to kill off the Russians. So it's very amusing to me when you hear these subversives here try to undermine or not give credit to the Jews for the mass murders they committed, both in Russia and, of course, their 15 satellite states in places such as Poland, Romania, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, etc. And they were the ones spreading this subversive ideology of communism, which essentially entails creating a Jewish slave state run by Jews, where they would oversee the slave labor of the Gentiles, because the Jews hate doing manual labor. They hate doing things like farming, and that's why they failed at it so many times. In fact, had to rely on Gentiles to be able to figure out food, just so they could steal it and sell it, of course. And they also had to rely on Henry Ford just to be able to figure out how to build cars, tractors, planes, etc. But prior to that, under Russia's Tsar regime, they knew how to build everything. They could build their own cars, their own trucks, their own tractors, and they were actually exporting them to the world. Again, they had one of the most sophisticated labor systems in the world, and they were successfully industrialized. They never needed communist industrialization at all, because the Jews never learned how to build anything. They just know how to steal other people's ideas and then take credit for it, except for communism, because I was inspired by the religious scribes through the Talmud. And go on and on. I notice we have hands. I don't know if you want to let this Jewish subversive continue with his line of lying. I don't think he understands what he's up against here. He's used to being able to interrupt people and try to challenge and question and play semantics and play the mental gymnastics the Jews like to do to try to avoid taking credit for the many crimes they've committed against humanity, and take credit for the 200 million plus people they've killed just through communism alone, in places like the USSR, of course, in China and many other countries where they spread this perverse and demonic ideology that involves atheism and the destruction also of Christianity. The Jews also destroyed 49,000 churches and killed 200,000 priests and monks within Russia with no shame, and they displaced many millions of people as well, including Muslims. They also destroyed mosques. You know what they didn't destroy, Ian? They didn't touch any of the synagogues. They also instituted an anti-Semitism law as soon as they took power in 1917, and they carved out a nice Jewish oblast for themselves by 1934. So it's always amusing to me when I hear these communist Jewish subversives come in and try to undermine or discount the extent to which the communism destroyed humanity, both in Russia, in the USSR, and also as it served as a useful tool for the Jews within America, because they were obviously all on the same team. The Jews always pledge allegiance to themselves first. How they're able to play the USSR off America to create these so-called, we call it war on terror today. Back then it would have been the bullshit Cold War. So this way they could go in and invade countries, pillage and steal the wealth, and then claim that America claimed the high moral ground and say, well, we're fighting communism, we're trying to end its spread. Meanwhile, they're actually collaborating with the communists through the Federal Reserve, which is funding both sides of the operation. So it's a very convenient tool. So when the individual mentions imperialist capitalism versus communism, they're just two sides of the same shekel. Once again, let's use these two so-called polar opposite economic ideologies, but in fact they're both connected through the Jewish-run federal central banking system that controls, runs, and funds both, so that this way the Jews can go and pillage countries and have an excuse to do that, and this way they can take their funny money, counterfeit money operation and swap it out in exchange for, you know, what they were funding arms and the arms trade, of course, and armies, so this way they could steal the natural resources, such as gold, silver, platinum, of course, oil and natural gas in the various countries they invade, while the currency still remained viable and relevant. And so far, you know, the dollar still remains a world reserve currency, propped up by the petrodollar. Prior to that, it was backed by gold, so you know they needed a lot of gold to steal, which is what they were doing essentially through these illegal invasions, again funded by the Jewish subversives at the Federal Reserve and also the various central banks in the one square mile city of London, and of course the autonomous area in Basel, Switzerland, where the Bank of International Settlements resides. That's the central bank of all central banks, again run by Jews. Thank you.
But, oh, there it is. There it is.